Hello everyone, my name is Feeper and welcome back to the channel. In today's video, I wanted to talk about hero talents and an issue that I think lies at the core of them. Overall, I am a very big fan of hero talents. I think they are a net positive for the game. Currently, I don't think they live up to Blizzard's stated goal of letting players have two different flavors of gameplay to choose from, but I do think they are pretty close to that. I think they are very close to being a great source of emergent gameplay and allowing players to express themselves through that gameplay. I think we can all agree that in an ideal world, a 50-50 split or a 60-40 split of hero talents is ideal. Players should be able to freely choose between the one that they prefer, or if they're a min-maxer, they can swap depending on the content that they're doing. I think this is Blizzard's goal and also what a majority of the player base wants. Thinking back to the first panel that they had when they announced hero talents, I remember them saying that they wanted to feel like, what flavor of Ret Paladin are you? They don't want it to just be, okay, here's your class, and then what spec do you like to play? It's also what hero talent within that spec do you like to play? But I argue that the core issue with hero talents is that too many of them are designed with one spec in mind, and then they were just retrofitted for the other spec to work. This is exacerbated by the classes that have multiple roles within them, and the examples I'm going to get into are for Monk and Paladin. I think these two classes really exemplify my point quite well because they have all three roles within them. And that role crossover is where Blizzard seems to really drop the ball in terms of design. Whereas if you look at something like Slayer for Warrior, I think Slayer works really well, both thematically and from a gameplay perspective for Arms and Fury. So the hero talents I want to talk about are Master of Harmony, Herald of the Sun, and Templar. Now this is all mostly from an M+ perspective, as that is basically the only thing I do in this game. But for as long as I can remember, every time I have dabbled with Ret Paladin, have seen Ret Paladins in my groups and inspected them, looked at what they're taking on Murloc and Archon, they're always taking Templar. I have never seen Herald of the Sun Ret Paladin be the meta. I think the reason for this is if you look at the design of Herald, it was very clearly, at least in my opinion, centered around Holy Paladin, and they started with Holy Paladin when they came up with the idea for Herald of the Sun. And then after they finished it for Holy Paladin, they were just like, okay, how do we make this work for Ret? Again, it feels like Blizzard started with one hero talent per spec and then made it work for the other one instead of thinking about how the hero talent works for the two specs that they're going to have it play on. For Herald, spreading your Dawn Lance as a healer makes a lot of sense because you don't have to tab target onto different allies because you're using Dander's Frames or Cell or something like that to target everyone, whereas having to tab target to spread your Dawn Lights from a DPS perspective is really annoying, and anytime that's a mechanic in the game, players find it to be very cumbersome and unengaging. It makes sense to spread your Dawn Lights as a healer, whereas a DPS, it feels weird and awkward. If you look at Templar, Templar was obviously made for Ret Paladin and then just retrofitted for protection. Now, Blizzard has done a really good job at adjusting Templar for Prot Paladin, but if we go back to the beginning of the War Within, I think some of these issues still lie at the core of Templar Prot Paladin and why it's almost never been meta and why it hasn't really been taken. So going back to the start of the War Within, first off, Light's Hammer was tied to Eye of Tyr for Protection Paladin. Now, this was a really big issue because you were forced into taking Eye of Tyr and the talent below it as a Templar Prot Paladin. So you basically lost 2 talent points in your spec tree just for playing a hero talent, and the trade-off just wasn't worth it. On top of that, Eye of Tyr at first did not generate holy power. It did not give you a free cast of Shield of the Righteous, and using Light's Hammer did not drop Consecration at your feet. This was a major issue back in the War Within because you basically had to generate 3 holy power, Shield of the Righteous, do it again, so you had some uptime on your active mitigation. You would be popping the different cooldown on the pull, on the gather. And then you'd have to drop your Consecration, because back then it was tied to your Mastery, and it was a much larger part of our mitigation. And then you would have to probably overlap your Eye of Tyr with a different defensive, and then build up 3 more Holy Power just to use it, and all it did was damage. Again, Blizzard has done a good job at fixing those issues, but it didn't take any, pro Protection Paladin player to let Blizzard know upon just reading the hero talent that, hey, this isn't really going to work for how Prot plays because it doesn't generate you holy power, it doesn't give you your active mitigation, it doesn't give you your consecration. All these things that needed to happen to make the hero talent even playable and feel remotely good just weren't there from the start. Again, I think that's a perfect example of how Templar was very obviously made with Retribution in mind, because Ret's always taking Wake of Ashes. It was tied to Wake of Ashes back then. That already gave you holy power, so you just press the same button twice. Whereas again, Prop Paladin, you had to build up a ton of holy power, you had to drop your consecration, you were doing things on pull, you had to then take 2 talent points out of your tree just to have your hero talent work. Like, it was just so cumbersome and awkward and weird. Now, if you look at Master of Harmony, it was the same issue. Funnily enough, I actually think Master of Harmony has kind of swapped sides. In the War Within, it was very obviously designed around Mistweaver, and now I think it's very much been retrofitted and warped to really fit around Brewmaster, and Mistweaver's basically been left in the dust. Back in the War Within, Mistweavers could generate vitality way faster than Brew, and then they could also expel it faster. The big difference, though, was that it was tied to their Thunder Focus Tea, which they had a lot more freedom about when they could use than Brewmaster. Once we saw the Thunder Focus Tea enhancing your Jade Lightning talent sort of come out, it was very, very easy to store up a bunch of vitality, pop that, press a big Jade Lightning, and just do a ton of damage and just blast everyone's health bar to full, basically, as long as you had more than like 2 targets. You were able to plan around your vitality and actually use it how you wanted to. Now looking at Brewmaster, since our vitality is tied to a defensive, we have a lot less choice in when we actually get to use it. Back in the War Within, Brewmaster was much less reliant on its stagger than it is now, and much more reliant on our defensives because we had 2 extra ones in Dampen Harm and Diffuse Magic. So because of this, and Purified Chi still being in the game, Celestial Brew was a much more vital part of our defensive toolkit, as opposed to it just being kind of like an extra damage button right now that we mostly pop off cooldown. And so the whole building vitality gameplay gimmick and then spending it when you want to doesn't really work for Brewmaster, because we have to just use our defensives to stay alive. We don't really have as much choice about when to press these buttons as a Mistweaver does with their Thunder Focus Tea. One spec got agency and choice, whereas the other gets almost none. For Brewmaster, Master of Harmony basically boiled down to just upkeeping a 20% increased damage debuff taken on the enemies, and you really didn't care about the vitality aspect of it at all. Now it's basically the opposite, whereas Brew is getting a lot more synergy from Master of Harmony because we get more Apex talents from our Celestial Infusions having 2 charges, and we can actually make use of expelling all our potential energy at once, whereas Mistweavers, it doesn't really make sense for them because sometimes they just get a little extra healing on Shaylins, but they don't get to really build up potential energy and then have it be a useful thing. It's just kind of a nice bonus, which I think by and large is not very engaging gameplay. I think Blizzard really needs to go back to the drawing board with some hero talents. Master of Harmony is a big one in my opinion, and really think about the class fantasy that they want for both specs, not just one, and how they both can use it. If a hero talent does not work for both specs, then I think the hero talent's just fundamental design is flawed. So hopefully I've illustrated my point well, but in the spirit of not giving critique without solutions, here is something that I would do for Master of Harmony that I think will help illustrate my point more and would also be much more engaging for both specs. Don't pay too much attention to the actual individual numbers and things here. This is just a rough outline of something that I would like to see them do. Obviously, I've not, gone through and thought about all the numbers and whatever. Again, this is just very high level overview of what I would do. So we keep the vitality building mechanic when you are in Master of Harmony, but when you select that hero talent, you get a new button, and we'll call it Enlightenment, let's say. It has 4 stages overall that depend on how much vitality you have stored when you use Enlightenment, and all those stages have compounding effects. Stage 1 can be something very simple, you just gain an X% damage increase. Stage 2, for Mistweaver, you get increased healing by a certain percent and haste. And then for Brewmaster, you get an X% DR and versatility buff, or maybe crit strike. Stage 3, you gain X movement speed, and Mistweaver gets a free Fort Brew or Chi Cocoon, and then Brewmaster gets a free Fort Brew or Celestial Brew / Infusion. And then stage 4, you become enlightened. And let's say, you double all the effects of all the previous stages. Remember, these all compound on each other. So stage 3 also gives you stage 1 and 2. So you double all the effects of the other stages. You double the effectiveness of your potential energy. You immediately gain 6 stacks of potential energy. And then Mistweaver casts a free Jade Fire Stomp, and Brewmaster casts a free Exploding Keg at their feet. Again, this is just a core outline of what I would do. Obviously, the nodes within would have to change, and where your damage is coming from would have to change and stuff and whatever. Maybe there could be some choice nodes that change what skills you cast at rank 3 and 4. But I think this overall just basic design works for Mistweaver and Brewmaster, but it doesn't leave either one of them in the dust. You'll see that there are mirroring effects on both sides, where each class is getting stats that they want and is getting tankier or more healing. And then the rank 4, you get this big burst of a lot of potential energy that feels really good to use, and you can plan around that as a big burst of damage or a big burst of healing. And then you're also getting a free Jade Fire Stomp, or you're getting a free Exploding Keg. It all works together in a cohesive way. This type of design also gives Blizzard more flexibility in terms of tuning, so they don't have to over-tune a certain hero talent just to make it viable and playable and then run into issues later on down the road. So these are just some thoughts I had on hero talents. I think, again, these are overall a net positive for the game. I do really like hero talents. I think they just leave a little bit to be desired, and they just need some tweaking, and a couple ones need a little bit of redesigning. I think they'll be in a really, really good spot. I think if we can get to a spot where the design of all of them is solid, and it's just a matter of numbers tuning, that would be ideal, because numbers tuning is far easier than design changes. Let me know what you all think in the comments below, and I will see you all in the next one. Peace.